Hello, my name is Bob Chapman and I am the Curator of Museums for the Waterville Historical Society. Today we're standing in front of the Sargent House, which is one of the three houses in the River Road campus for our society. The Sargent House itself was, we believe, built in about 1834 on lot 39, which was plotted here by John Prey back in the early 1830s. He sold it to Edward and Rowena Sargent, who built a cabin here, which was originally just this section of the building. And about 10 years later, he added on this south section for what we believe is his offices and his meeting room. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do a little traveling. We're going to travel back in time about 200 years ago and see what life would have been like along the river here in Waterville, Ohio. Right now we're standing in what would have been the living room, dining room, family room for the Sargent family. Behind me are two doors that would have led to what we believe were the bedrooms. They had two small bedrooms in here. The thing is, now there's just one big room, so I wanted to explain why we have two doors going into one room right next to each other. So when we go in here, you'll see what I'm talking about. This is the Native American room, where the artifacts that we've found here in southwest Lucas County and northwest Wood County were collected. Over 200 years ago, before the Europeans came here, Native Americans were here, and the artifacts they left weren't quite as numerous as what the white people did. They left only their stone implements, and which were found by farmers here in the county during their plowing of their fields along the river. We have several collections of Native American artifacts that were brought to us by these farmers. One of them was Carl Schweb. We have a large collection of his artifacts that were found when he was plowing. And we have another collection over here. These artifacts belong to Bernard Oots, who also was a farmer and collected along the river. These smaller arrowheads here that you see were used probably for small game like squirrel and rabbit, those types of things. But then when you get to the larger arrowheads, they would have been used for the larger animals like the deer. And then of course they have lots of these big hammers too that were used, which as far as we know, they used them as axes and hammers just to do their daily work. Of all the counties in Ohio that were named after the Indian tribes that lived in this area. These are all through the state of Ohio. Now we're in the center room of the Sargent House, which was the living room, dining room, family room, kitchen, everything that the Sargents needed to live here in this house. They would have had probably originally a stone fireplace here. Now we have an iron fire stove put in here. And they would have cooked their meals here. They would have did everything that they did other than sleeping in their bedrooms in this one room here. Over here, I'm gonna move.
Yeah, do that.
Over here in this corner, we have examples of what were called samplers. These were cloth that children would use to learn their ABCs and their numbers. They would sew those things into these samplers. This is just an old one. It has a date of 1823, but it doesn't say anything else about the person that did it. And it wasn't finished either. So we use this as an example. Up here we have a sampler that this is actually just a picture of the sampler because this is an old sampler, very expensive, and we keep it locked away where it's safe and climate controlled. This was done by a girl named Rowena Sargent when she was 10 years old, and she dated it August 24th, 1849, Waterville, Lucas County, Ohio, and she put Rowena P. Sargent, age 10 years. So she was here in this house, maybe in this room, sewing this sampler when she was 10 years old in 1849. It was found by members of our society in an auction in southern Ohio. They bought it, brought it back here, took pictures of it so we could show it here, and then we have it in our possession. In order to be able to do these samplers, they had to have material and fiber to do this thing. And what they would do was they would have to make their own material to sew it. So we have a display over here showing how that flax, linen, which was what they sewed these samplers on. You go out along the river and you pull out some of the flax plants. You bring them up here, you would crunch them, you would pull on them, stretch them out, you would soak them in water, and then you would put them on a flax break, which would crunch it down to break the fibers down so it wasn't so stiff. And then you would put it on a scrunching board and use a knife to scrape it down. We have one here that they would have used to scrape down that fiber to get it soft. Then they would have drung it through a hackle, which we have here. A bunch of large, almost like nails, that they would have drug it through to split up those fibers in that flax plant. They would put it on a flax wheel. We would have put it on a flax wheel to spin it up, and then they would have wound it up onto this here to the bobbin spinner to spread the string out and to get it stretched out. They would have wrapped it on a frame, and let's see, they would have used a swift to keep stretching it. This spins around, and they would have put it on here and kept spinning, twisting that yarn, spinning and spinning. And eventually they would use that yarn, put it on a shuttle or on a frame to where they would knit all that string together to make the material. They would wash and bleach it and roll it up, and then they would have their linen to do their projects with. They couldn't go to the store and buy anything. There was no Myers or any of those stores here at that time. In fact, it wasn't until later on that there was any stores around here. The only thing they had was John Pray's trading post down by where the Columbian House is. So they had to make what they needed from what was here available to them. Now we're standing in what was probably the offices for Edward Sargent, who became Justice of the Peace in 1849. He would have had his business right here in his house, but since his house, which was just the living room and those bedrooms, there wasn't enough room for him to be able to do his business, so we believe he built this addition on so that he could have a meeting room here and an office space behind me. When the Historical Society decided to buy this building, they were going to tear it down to make a parking lot for the Robbins house next door. But the night before the wrecking company was supposed to come and tear it down, they looked inside this part up above and realized that this building was actually an old timber frame building, and it was probably older than the Robbins house, which it was discovered to be. So what we're going to do is look at some of the construction that they used to build this building. You'll notice above me how these big beams were where the ceiling was at one time. There would have been lath on it, like you notice on the wall here. This is wood lath that plaster was applied to make the walls. But if you look at these beams up here, you'll notice where there's cuts in them that was produced by the blade of the axe that they used to square these things up. These huge timbers were just trees from this neighborhood that they cut down and made into these beams. The way they attached it to the old building, if you'll notice here, pegs, the huge wooden pegs that they drilled a hole through and then nailed it into the side of the other building to hold it in place. This is the back room that we believe was the office for Edward Sargent when he was Justice of the Peace. And in this room, we've put some of the artifacts that we believe would have been used to build a house like this. There's different types of hammers, axes, planes, wedges, whatever might be needed to make the wood to produce this building. You can also see over here the way they would have done it. They would have laid a log out, spiked it down with these spikes, and then would have used a broad axe to chisel along the side of it to cut out the squares, the way they made the beams for these buildings. They also had a saw that they could have used to cut the wood. There's different types of scribing tools, planes, and other tools that they would have used to build the building. Out behind the Sargent House, they had a root cellar that was underneath this door. There was a stairway that led down underneath the house, and underneath there it was always cool. It's like a refrigerator, so the vegetables and fruits that they collected through the summer, they could store them down in that root cellar through the wintertime. Also, it was a nice place to go for safety. Northwest Ohio, we have tornadoes. They would have had to go down in there. That would be their little tornado shelter that they could stay in.